Yes, we're in the middle of talking about Roncalli's sufferings, quote unquote, during the quote unquote persecution of the modernists. That's certainly how the modernists themselves perceived it, as a persecution of people who are in good faith, certainly, and definitely only acting with the best of intentions, and what we say is really not so bad, and we're only objecting to the fact that the church is telling us how we should think, as opposed to simply what must be believed. Because remember, was the complaint of the Archbishop of Albi, Archbishop Mignot, who said that they are organizing a white terror. White terror, in other words, there's not a red terror in which blood is being shed, but a white terror, which means that it's perhaps no violent means are being used, and obviously there were not. But he's complaining that this is they're still terrorizing us in the realm of ideas and notions. We used to believe that in order to be a good Catholic, it was sufficient to believe all the truths which God revealed or the Church taught. And now it seems that more is needed, namely that the Church should tell us not only what must be believed, but how we should think. And again, we saw the absurdity of this complaint. You're perfectly safe if you follow all the prescriptions of the Church, and not only what exactly divine revelation contains, but also the terms in which to express that. At the very least, you'll be safe from, individuals can make mistakes, obviously, but you won't be led into any error in following the systems prescribed by the Church. And it's not as though the Church leaves options open for this. The Church, it is the duty of the Church to provide for the safeguarding of divine revelation, and that means, of course, making sure that it is explained clearly and correctly, and in such a way that people will not be led into error through confusion. And this is exactly the reason why the deposit of faith is continually expounded upon. We'll avoid the term development because that has a modernist sense to it, but that it is truly expounded upon and made more explicit, explained more clearly with time. Excuse me, just let me check this. So, of course, in following the Church, you're certainly safe from any error in that respect, any error in what you are actually, say, the truths to which you assent. And it's not to say that everything proposed, say, by a pope in an encyclical is meant as a definition. A pope could intend that, but that's not necessarily the case. But at the very least, it's safe from any pernicious error. That is to say, it cannot possibly contradict which comes before. So really, the Vatican II is dead just on that point. Clearly, it doesn't even have that. That's that negative infallibility. It contradicts the teachings of the Church, Vatican II itself, of course, and certainly the religion that flowed from Vatican II, because we should always keep that in mind, that Vatican II was just a starting point. And yes, it does have heresies within its own documents, no doubt of that. But those heresies were also the starting points for many other heresies, and so now the Novus Ordo just every single day contradicts many of the teachings of the Church. And they're completely dead just on that point. So, the fact that this is all being said, this is just one example, just one example of somebody who complained about the methods and the measures taken by St. Pius X against modernism, that to complain that the Church is telling us not only what truths are contained in divine revelation, but also how to express those, in which terms. To complain about that is just mind-boggling. Anybody with the virtue of faith, committed to the preservation of the faith, or to the good of souls, can only see that as a good thing. Yes, individuals make mistakes, but individuals who make mistakes in good faith, once they realize their mistakes, they set themselves straight. And that's true in anything. Not only in matters of faith, but in anything. Someone who makes a mistake in good faith will correct himself once he realizes the error of his ways. the Pope is demanding an absolute assent to formularies which are not of faith, at least not in all their parts, so that authority binds us while not binding itself. Obviously, the Roman Pontiff is bound to his own definitions as much as anybody. If a Pope were to deny a teaching, to deny one of his own definitions, he would be saying a heresy. Yeah, there are authors who would deny that it's even possible for the Pope to become a heretic. But should the Pope do that, should that turn out ever to be the case, then the Pope himself would be a heretic for that. Authority does, in that sense, he who is invested with authority binds himself to believing exactly what he defines. But this complaint here that the Pope is demanding assent to formularies which are not of faith, at least not in all their parts. Certainly, anything to which St. Pius X, and you have to always take with a grain of salt what these people say in these complaints. But anything certainly that St. Pius X was requiring to be believed, or to commitment to which was to be certified and proclaimed in the anti-modernist oath, all at the very least pertains to the preservation of the faith. And we must do all of the means involved in preserving it must be followed just in obedience to the authority of the Church. So all these complaints ultimately are just nonsensical. But notice this: in such a crunch situation, Don Roncalli inevitably had to side with the Pope. In other words, without actually changing any of his ideas, he had to feign submission. The biographer is not going to say that because he likes Roncalli, but that's what that means. In other words, what's a little deceit when, in something like this, when you're in a situation of necessity like that. So as a priest professor, there was no way he could elude the oath. And just in itself, the idea that the oath was something to be eluded, we've said before, is something appalling, just on its own, just that very notion that there's something you have to avoid. So, rehashing some things we saw earlier, but his quotation of the maxim of St. Alphonsus, the Pope's will, God's will, being less ultramontane, we covered that also before as being actually a badge of honor to anyone to whom that is to be applied. That is not to be applied, clearly, to Roncalli, at least not quite so much as you'd think. Seeing that, but of course we'll see his problems in more to a greater extent here shortly. So I remember Roncalli saying, "In a whirlwind, one cannot see very clearly. It causes what Newman called a night battle, where each one fights for himself, and friend and foe stand together." So whatever precisely he means by that. He does also say that the biographer says, in the teeth of the whirlwind, Don Roncalli clung to the papacy and to the faith of the Church. Again, I have a sikh there because the biographer does not capitalize Church, but tries to disentangle this faith from the quarrel between medievals and moderns by stressing that the Church contains within herself the eternal youth of the truth and of Christ, and is of all ages. So he's trying to distance himself from all of this, as though I'm not a part of this whole thing, which actually was typical of the New Theology people. They would talk about the modernist crisis, so that's something that's clearly over and done. What we're doing here is something different, and clearly the way they talk about the reign of St. Pius X, about modernists of that time, about the anti-modernists of that time, about St. Pius X himself, they're setting themselves up. Just from the very tone of it, it's clear they're setting themselves up in judgment on this. All of these people, small-minded people arguing about modernism, were far higher above that. So it's just one way of camouflaging, just another way of camouflaging that they themselves are in fact modernists. They make use of all of their vague terminology, which is ultimately meaningless. In a way, it's meaningless. In another way, they know exactly what they're saying, but they're using the most vague means possible, using as much verbal fog as they can possibly pump out of their endless verbal fog machines in order to hide what they're actually saying. So that's one method of camouflaging. Another is just setting themselves up in judgment on all of this. They're just another way of distancing themselves from yesterday's modernists, and that way trying to deflect suspicion. Now, these people, they talk about all of the modernists of the past, and they criticize them to some degree, and sure, they might say some things that come across as critical. All of that is just to distance themselves from suspicion. That's it. If it doesn't hold up to scrutiny by anybody who actually looks at it closely, anybody who inspects what they're actually saying, indeed, you can see through it, and especially when you understand that these are not people who are in good faith. And it shines through ultimately. You would say mostly that they're always very foggy and unclear, and as you've probably seen by now in reading some of their texts, occasionally they are clear. They can be clear when they want to be. And whenever they are clear, it's true. Two things that come across very clearly are hatred of Thomism, hatred of the faith, ultimately. They cannot stand it. They cannot stand St. Thomas, and they cannot stand the fact that it surrounds a divine revelation like a fortress. Clearly, they do not like, they hate, in fact, they hate neo-scholasticism, as they put it. That always comes through very clearly. And why do they hate it? Because it defends divine revelation from them, ultimately. So, Roncalli is already, he's ahead of the curve in that sense, already distancing himself from that. So he realized he was one of the more cleverer ones from the start. Of course, he was a young priest at the time. He was not very prominent, even though he did manage to get on the Sodalicium's watch list, as we'll see. But even so, he was slippery about it. He figured out the advantages of being clever in this. So this theme would remain very dear to him. The church, again, not uncapitalized for some reason, demonstrates its perennial youthfulness by its capacity for renewal. Perhaps there wasn't much evidence of this in 1910 to 1911, so that's the biographer being anti-St. Pius X again. In the autumn of 1911, Don Roncalli had first-hand experience of what the anti-modernist campaign really meant. So clearly this author agrees with the notion that it's a white terror, and is now going to illustrate all of the supposed horrors of this white terror. Now keep in mind, fervent Catholics at this time were very happy to see that modernism was being exposed, and were not suffering any kind of psychological damage as a result of it. Definitely not. So it was, and the biographer says, it was less agreeable on one's own doorstep than when contemplated in the quiet of a retreat. The trouble was a famous Jesuit, Father Guido Maciusi, professor of theology at the Milan faculty, and a thorn in the flesh of Cardinal Ferrari. So you know he must be good. Just from that statement. He had anticipated Pascendi with an article in 1902 and 1903, Il Veleno Kantiano, in which he presented Thomism as the only true antidote to the poison of Immanuel Kant, which is a good prescription. His two lectures at the Bergamo Seminary set the whole city and diocese by the ears. So by that he means taking somebody who's misbehaving and start slapping him on the ears, start beating them up like that. That's the imagery here. I mean, he went to them and started smacking them around for being bad, which clearly they deserve. I think we've established that by now, at least, that they deserve to be disciplined, certainly. The pros and cons were debated in the press. Rudini Tedeschi asked Don Roncalli for a private report. Study of it will permit further nuances to our understanding of Roncalli's attitude to modernism. And so this is why we will look at it. Roncalli begins by saying that the good father, no irony intended, according to the biographer anyway, no irony intended, had made a bad impression from the start. He insulted his audience by not preparing his lectures. Again, we have to take all this with a grain of salt because this is coming from Roncalli. Maybe, maybe not. I wasn't there. I can't say for myself. But Roncalli is obviously biased against Father Maciusi. Obviously. They were so disorganized that he couldn't remember what he had said on their previous occasion and was incapable even of summing up at the end. Yeah. Supposedly, I wasn't there. I cannot say. If so, that's obviously not good if his lectures were disorganized. But at the same time, Roncalli needs to look past that. But clearly, he's just trying to say anything bad he could possibly say about Matthiusi. He'll find it and he will say it. That is number one thing here. Evidently, Matthiusi had trusted his talent for improvisation. He had gathered together a few thoughts on the short train ride from Milan to Bergamo, according to Roncalli, all of this. Worse still, Matthiusi's persistently harsh and polemical tone was offensive. So this is, I remember future quote-unquote good Pope John saying this, who doesn't like anything polemical. He saw nothing positive in anyone. Well, maybe he wasn't coming to say anything positive. Maybe there wasn't anything positive to say about the people in which were in the place in which he was speaking. The result was a quote-unquote jaundiced and distorted view of life. Through Roncalli's eyes, anyway, the way life should look. The truth, and the whole truth has to be stated, wrote Roncalli, but I could not understand why it had to be accompanied by thunderbolts and storm claps from Mount Sinai, rather than the calm and serenity of Jesus on lakeside or mountain. As though there could be a contradiction between those two things, in any case. Clearly sometimes thunderbolts are needed, and sometimes calm and serenity is the preferable course, but the idea that there could be a contradiction between Mount Sinai and our Lord's preaching is an absurdity in itself. He admits that this could be simply, it probably should have been simply, but this is a quote from the book, simply due to a difference of temperament. So it's always Matthiusi, he's a little bit harsh and nasty, but no, maybe it's just because that's the way he is. Yeah, never mind. In other words, there's no possibility that maybe he actually has something urgent to say, and maybe the people whose errors he is excoriating actually are deserving of that discipline, and maybe these are actually serious errors. None of that. At the most, it's just because he's in a bad mood. His temperament means that he's given to getting into a bad mood, and that's it. Nothing worse than that. Because everybody is basically fine. Clearly that's Roncalli's attitude here. That whatever is the case, whatever the explanation for this, it's definitely not that what he's saying is true and accurate. Definitely not that. That's before even getting into any of this, that has been determined upon clearly. However hard he tried, Roncalli, could not enter into the system of Matthiusi. Such was the utter contrast, repugnanza, between his character and mine. So, reducing it to a question of personality differences. And I found him grating, but that's because he's of a different character than I am. Matthiusi was too absolute and one-sided in his judgments. And some typo there. Matthiusi was too absolute and one-sided in his judgments. The result was that the students failed to grasp how the principles he expounded could be combined with other principles that were equally true and of the greatest importance for Catholicism. So, for one thing, is if you sometimes there are apparent difficulties in things, but those can be sorted out. It's not as though he's set up some kind of insurmountable difficulty here, even according to what Roncalli is describing. The Catholic thing, supposedly, Roncalli knew, or at least thought, was to hold on to both ends of the chain and to allow complementary truths to stand in creative tension with each other. Now that is typically modernist right there, and perfectly so. Letting, there's a mystery here, and contradiction is not such a bad thing because it allows for friction and good things come out of this clash. It's pretty Hegelian, if you think about that. It's Roncalli. As an example of Matthiusi's one-sidedness, he cites his treatment of the act of faith. So following Biot in his De Ecclesia, the same work that Roncalli had received from his fellow students in Bergamo, Matthiusi argued that only the external proofs of Jesus' mission miracles and the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies really counted in the act of faith. Now, remember that what we're getting here is a caricature, in fact, of the Catholic teaching on divine revelation, of Catholic apologetics concerning the truth of the faith, proofs of the truth of the faith. Anybody who's studied De Relatione has seen all of this, the motives of credibility, which prove that the faith is in fact divinely revealed. Because, just backing up to that a little bit, yes, it's, for one thing, you start in the De Relatione course by seeing that the existence of God is something that natural reason can prove easily on its own. That anybody can see that and see it easily. Now, once that has been established, that is one of the preambles of faith. In other words, once you have concluded that God in fact exists, you may then assent to things that God has revealed. So it is called, the existence of God is one of those things that falls under the preambles of faith. That is, before you make an act of faith in God revealing, you first have to acknowledge, of course, that God in fact exists, which is abundantly obvious. That's the point here. But once you have established that, then you can make acts of faith, because God can reveal things to us and clearly indicate that this is Almighty God revealing this. And God may choose any number of ways of revealing things, any way that he pleases. He can talk to people directly, to a large number of people directly, if he chooses, of course, or he can give the information to prophets who will retain perfectly what they have been assigned to preach, and then relay it also infallibly. That is the gift of prophecy. And also, it's talking here that only the external proofs really count in the act of faith. The external proofs, it's true, the miracles and prophecies, so not only fulfilling Old Testament prophecies, but also our Lord himself making further prophecies. He leaves that out here too. Prophecies and miracles, yes, are the strongest motives of credibility. They're not the only ones. There are such things as internal motives of credibility, but the strongest ones are those, prophecies and miracles. The working of miracles and not only the fulfilling, but also the making of prophecies. Of course, our Lord did all of that, all in proof of his divinity. And that everybody who saw our Lord during his earthly life acknowledged it, even his enemies. You recall that the Jews started saying at some point, he's working so many miracles, people are starting to follow him in large numbers, we have to do something about this. In other words, they didn't even debate that those were true miracles. They were obviously true miracles. They were obviously being worked in confirmation of our Lord's doctrine. So that was not something they even denied. So they knew that Christ was God. They knew that they were committing deicide. But the point is that those are the strongest motives of credibility. But there are other internal ones. But you see all of that. You go into all of that in detail in De Revelazione. But for us of importance here, the modernists ignore those, and they focus on the internal proofs, which have to do with the fact that, the Catholic faith, they say, is such a beautiful thing, and it appeals to us because of that. It fulfills all of man's highest aspirations. All of that is undeniably true. But the modernists focus on that to the exclusion of prophecies and miracles, because the fact of the matter is they deny that those things are possible. But they still want to, remember, their idea is to transform the Catholic Church and to make it into a part of a dogmaless humanitarian religion. And, how can you possibly enter into the same religion as the liberal Protestants, for example, who themselves deny prophecies and miracles, or anybody else who never accepted, never even called himself a Christian, and clearly never accepted any of the prophecies or miracles worked to establish the truth of the Catholic faith, that this is in fact revealed by God. So they have to do away with all that and instead say, you should let us into this dogmaless religion because our system is just so beautiful and nice and fulfills man's highest aspirations. So those are the internal that touches upon. We're not going to all the full explanation of it here, but putting all that together, the internal and the primary ones, these much stronger ones, the external proofs, which clearly can only be worked by the power of God, putting all of that together, yes, absolutely. In every way, the Catholic faith is shown to have been revealed by God. But yeah, prophecies and miracles are the strongest because those are the clearly can only be worked by the power of God. A miracle, the suspension of the laws of nature, or a prophecy, the foretelling of some future event, and usually in considerable detail. And also the fulfilling of that. So our Lord says, pointing to all of the Old Testament prophecies concerning the Messiahs, indicating clearly, I am the one who fulfills all of these things. And also I'm making other prophecies, which some of which, of course, have come to pass. That's a very interesting route to go down. It's not our focus here, but this is a good occasion on which to clarify some of these things. You see. Modernists will say, absolutely, there are motives of credibility that prove the Catholic faith. And the Catholic faith is divinely revealed, but they're talking about only internal proofs. So if you ever read any author who focuses on the internal proofs to the exclusion of prophecies and miracles, you know right away you're dealing with, at the very least, a modernizer. At the very least, if not an outright modernist. And remember that the modernizers are the more dangerous ones, in fact. So it's even worse, actually, than just reading something by an outright modernist. So the external proofs, he says, Roncalli is complaining that Mattiusi is saying that the external proofs are the only ones that really count, and never said by any serious Catholic theologian that those don't count. But they definitely do figure into things. There's no question of that. But he's complaining about it because I wasn't there to hear what Mattiusi said. Obviously, I'd never had any access to whatever lecture notes he may have had. But definitely, if he himself was correct, he did not say that the internal proofs are worthless. He definitely would not have said that. Definitely, Garrigo does not say that, whose text we use here for De Revelatione. He talks about the fact that those definitely are subordinate to the external proofs, which are stronger, but that they are indeed proofs. So there's no question of that. Just they have to be kept in their proper place, that's all. So he says, but notice what they refer to as internal proofs, appeals to religious experience or prayer, were dismissed as subjective and leading to the dreaded immanentism said to be advocated by Maurice Blondel, Mattiusi's current bête noire. So that means it's, of course, French for black beast, somebody you have a great disliking for. No doubt you've covered some of Blondel's ideas. He was a contributor to the New Theology. He's listed among by people who, in more recent works, since long after Vatican II, have pointed to as somebody who caused that, contributed to it anyway. Yeah, they'll point to as many people as possible as originators of the New Theology to give it as much veneer of respectability as they can. So some of the people they list as having contributed to it seem not to have been, perhaps if they did so in good faith somehow, one way or another. But Blondel may have said some good things, but he was definitely problematic. But he's not our focus here. So it's true, to focus on only the internal proofs does indeed lead to subjectivism. Modernism is exactly that. It's an immanentistic religion. The Novus Ordo is, you can see that just from the way that they behave in their own church buildings, clearly are part of an immanentistic religion in which God is one of the guys. And so just as you can behave casually sometimes among your buddies and make jokes about them, so also you can do the same with God in the house of God, places where they supposedly carry on the worship of God. They can do that. So that's why they just show up dressed however, and there's absolutely no sense of reverence for anything, least of all supposedly the Blessed Sacrament. So you can really see that, and people who come to the traditional Mass for the first time, even if they only see the externals of it, if it's invalid, even if it's within the Novus Ordo being offered by invalidly ordained priests, people are struck very greatly by some things that for us are just normal, say just the reverence towards the Blessed Sacrament, that only a priest handles the Blessed Sacrament. Again, we were talking about cases where it's not actually the Blessed Sacrament, where they don't have the externals, the trappings of the way that the Blessed Sacrament was traditionally treated. But some of the most basic things, that only the priest handles the Blessed Sacrament, people receive Holy Communion kneeling, and whether it's valid or not, we're abstracting from that. But people are immediately impressed by those kinds of things. Things that to any practicing traditional Catholic just perfectly normal, and how could you possibly do anything different? How could you possibly ever engage in any other practice? People are struck by that all the time. Just because it immediately, everything about the actual Mass says that this is, we are worshiping a transcendent God here. In other words, a God who is not part of this world. God is not one of the guys. This is not a immanentistic, pantheistic religion. People notice those things immediately. And those were the first things that really moved people to cause the traditional movement in the first place, was the fact that they reacted to the Novus Ordo as being something is off about this. This doesn't speak to me as being Catholic. And indeed, immediately it does not. So that was really just, for the most part, at the beginning, that was just a gut reaction, which was a good instinct, even if if it had not been explained, all the reasoning behind it had not been developed at that point. The instinct was correct. This is somehow where something is substantially changing here. And there had been people at the time, they were used to a great many liturgical changes. Remember, there have been regular, constant liturgical changes since the early 50s at that point, by the time of the late 60s when the Novus Ordo was promulgated. People were used to just constant change. And that was one of the reasons why the clergy swallowed it for the most part. But there were people who realized that this change is, there's been a lot of change over the last couple of decades, but this is something clearly different. Even to what I might call in some sense the traditional Mass, Paul VI made different changes through the mid-60s. It was all moving towards the Novus Ordo, making things resemble more and more the Novus Ordo before that came out fully developed. But it was started dropping the last Gospel at the end of Mass, things like that. People had been seeing moves in that direction, but they all started objecting when the Novus Ordo was finally promulgated. So it's all because they could sense at this point this is really a switch. This is the switch to, they understood, at least instinctively, this is a switch to the worship of that belongs to an immanentistic religion, which is not the Catholic faith. That people picked up on that. So, Roncalli's biographer says, this account of the act of faith has been described as the apologetics of the robot. Man, given the appropriate external circumstances, is programmed to believe. And that is false. That it completely ignores grace. It even denies it. It seems to deny grace here. That somebody it is possible, actually, to come to the conclusion that the Catholic faith, that is divinely revealed. It seems to be. Everything about it, all the proofs are there. There's no way I could deny this. There's no way I could disagree with it. But somebody could still never give the assent of faith. There are stories of that. For example, among the North American martyrs, the French Jesuit missionaries evangelizing the Indians. They said there were cases in which there were some who said, oh yes, I completely agree with everything you're saying. It's all correct. I have no objections. But then they would just continue in their pagan practices. Because that's just what they do. They never actually embrace the faith. Or certainly not the practice of it. They never seem to give the assent of faith. It's possible to do that. Without grace, or if they refuse to cooperate with grace, that's it. They can understand that I couldn't possibly make objection to this, but still refuse to assent to it. So grace is definitely required, and it's not simply because you comprehend that this is true, will you necessarily accept it. There's nothing robotic about it. And this is also making a caricature, really, of the Church's teaching on grace, which is, of course, even among Catholics, that is historically hotly controverted certain points. All Catholics all agreed on all the definitions of the Church, everything that was of faith. But there were certain controverted points which were so hotly debated that popes had to step in and say, don't call each other heretics. The debates between the Dominicans and the Jesuits. The Pope had to step in and say, don't call each other heretics. You're not allowed to do that. Of course, Gary Gu goes right up to the line. He says talking about certain errors, he says that it's almost heresy. He goes about as close to saying that as you can possibly get without actually saying it. But yeah, it was never that was never authoritatively settled. There was never a definition on those points. So you can be definitely wrong about something theologically without becoming a heretic. But that's something those are matters that could use definitions. So this is again a caricature of the Church's teachings on the motives of credibility for the faith, and also the Church's teachings on grace. Talking about saying that Catholic theologians, again, assuming, of course, that Petrizzi actually presented everything correctly, saying that the Church's teachings on these things are actually really, ultimately, that's exactly it, criticizing the Church's teachings on these things and saying that they're somehow defective and wrong. So he says, the believer becomes a passive, inert tabula rasa, which again is false. Yes, absolutely, it requires grace to assent, to give the assent of faith. But that grace is freely cooperated with, of course, that free cooperation itself coming from God. All on the principle that everything good comes from God. Everything that's bad comes from us. So somebody sees that the Catholic faith has been divinely revealed, comprehends all the motives of credibility, but refuses to give assent, that's all on him, 100% on him. God is not in any way bound to give him the graces necessary for that. But if, on the other hand, somebody does assent to it, gives the assent of faith, that grace comes from God. Yeah, that person truly does and freely assents. He is not made into a robot. He is definitely not made into a robot. But it is only because, without that grace, he would not have done it. That free cooperation comes from God. It's all very mysterious. This is all this you study in your dogmatic theology courses. So this is why you can see people can get troubled by some of those things. But when you really study it, you realize actually, absolutely, it could not be any other way. So against all of this, Roncalli is hinting. Notice hinting, only hinting, but still hinting against it. He hinted that if everything labeled experience is to be ruled out of court in the act of faith, then theology becomes a kind of geometry, faith the conclusion to an argument, and the theologian a desiccated mathematician. So desiccated, all dried up, not flowing with any of the juices of modernist mystery or something. What exactly he means by that, it's purposely vague, but that's the idea. Clearly something bad. You're just made into a robot, and you're just nothing but dry mathematical reasoning. Again, as if proving the truth of the faith is somehow contrary to fervent ardor, to a serious spiritual life. There's no contradiction between the internal proofs correctly understood and the external motives of credibility. And again, if anybody may not have studied the Revelazione, of course, motives of credibility there are even natural motives of credibility because of which you believe anybody telling you anything, even if someone you know tells you something, you believe that person because you know that he knows what he's talking about and tells the truth. Anybody who fails to meet either of those things is somebody you not believe. So somebody who either may not be a liar, may not consciously deceive anybody, but doesn't know what he's talking about, you're not going to believe what he says. On the other hand, somebody who might be extremely intelligent, but who has a habit of lying, you won't believe him either. So you have to have certitude moral certitude for both of those things, just to believe, to make any act of faith, even a natural act of faith. In other words, believing something that you yourself have not seen. You have to make an act of human faith, which is not just something that can be done by anybody under any circumstances. Anybody who has the use of reason, certainly. Believing something that someone tells him. Because I know this person knows what he's talking about and he doesn't lie. Because that's why you believe anybody telling you anything. Now, when it comes to the act of faith, the virtue whereby we give assent, the assent of the intellect to truths revealed by God because of the authority of God revealing, you need to have certitude that this, what you're giving assent to, has actually been revealed by God. And so the motives of credibility for establishing the Catholic faith must be there. They must apply to everything that we believe as being part of the Catholic faith, being truths of the faith. So all of that, if you like that, then you'll definitely like the De Revelatione course. Here we're just touching upon this because this is one point in which the modernists must be refuted, is their understanding of, explanation of, and use of the motives of credibility as they understand them. So here and even the author of the biography puts this in quotes, spirituality saved him from the one-sided excesses of the anti-modernists. Anti-modernists are Catholics, for it taught him to verify his insights in prayer. Now, talking about excesses, is it possible for someone who is opposed to modernism to be imprudent? Yes, definitely. But coming from these people, that cannot be seen as a conviction, certainly not. Anybody who may have been imprudent in one or another case, well, that has to be assessed independently. But definitely we're not taking anybody's word for it here that there's actually that Roncalli was actually subject to any excesses, that he was actually subject to persecution, unjust persecution or anything like that. For I taught him to verify his insights in prayer, and as if that were somehow opposed to the motives of credibility for the faith. That prayer, you can either go for one or the other, either for prayer or for proving the truth of the faith. To set up an opposition there is absurd. It took courage for a 29-year-old professor in a provincial seminary to say this against such powerful, quote-unquote, establishment theologians such as Biot and Matthiusi. So, remember we saw earlier that Roncalli could only get away with this because he had powerful friends who were modernists or modernizers, who could keep him, quote-unquote, safe from St. Pius X and the Sodalitium, everybody working for St. Pius X, either directly or through the Sodalitium. In collaboration with Benigni. So he says, the author of the biography at this point says that it also showed, all of the foregoing, showed that Roncalli had a clear grasp of the theological issues involved in the anti-modernist campaign. So if that's true, that's a condemnation of Roncalli. Maybe he did. Maybe he actually understood what the church teaches on the motives of credibility, but if he did, that means he's denying it. Or perhaps not outwardly saying, I disbelieve that. That would have just merited him condemnation outright. But instead, he's doing it in a hinting way. You see, that has been the method of the modernists always do. Well, certainly from this point on. To the Novus Ordo to this day. When you read their documents and when you can manage to get through it, you can get past all of the excess verbiage that they still use all the time, then you can find very few things that are explicit heresies. Generally, every now, yes, certainly you can find explicit heresies, but more often than not, you come away with general impressions. Impressions, clearly what they're trying to get through here. You figure it out. The bottom line becomes clear by the end of the probably, ascetical act of reading one of their documents. That's a painful thing to do. When you finally get to the end of that, you have definite impressions. Again, could you go back and, when you put your general impressions into words, could you then go back and find those words in the document? No. But that was meant to be that way. They're purposely vague. They purposely give you certain obvious hints. Just the way that they say things, the way that they generally move toward certain conclusions without actually stating them. All of that is deliberate and perfectly modernist. And clearly Roncalli is something of a pioneer in that method. And he was one of the ones who figured out clearly early on, if you want to avoid condemnation, you've got to be clever about it. You've got to camouflage yourself, conceal yourself. The modernists at his time, say Loisy, for example, did not realize that. Or if he realized it, he realized it too late. Maybe he just didn't care. In any case, he certainly didn't employ those methods. So Roncalli, was far from being the theological simpleton that some have imagined. Again, if that's true that he was theologically acute, then that's another condemnation of him. That means that he knew what he was denying and denied it anyway. So that's But again, this author, in this author's mind, this is something good. That's something you want to make clear about this guy that you like. This arch modernist that you like. Ultimately, again, if you are just knowing how to read all of this correctly, it actually turns out to be very damning. But it was in the treatment of individuals that Machiusi really became offensive and unjust in the eyes of Roncalli. He denounced Duchenne, and we'll get more on him later, concentrating on the Loisy-type errors which his work contains and which have been admitted. So just a refresher on Loisy. Loisy wrote these words: "Whatever the fate of Catholicism may be in time to come, I cannot change it. What the religion of the future will be, I do not know. Roman Catholicism, as such, is destined to perish, and it will deserve no regrets." So he said again, early 20th century, during the reign of St. Pius X. He said that. No wonder this creep got excommunicated and reduced to the lay state, saying things like that, and refusing to retract them. So he's saying, the way that the flourishing state of the church in the early 20th century, during the reign of St. Pius X, he's talking about that as something that's destined to perish. Just imagine saying that at the time. The time that we now look back on wistfully, saying, this is destined to perish. Of course, the irony of it is that what he set up, what he had a tremendous hand in developing, that is now perishing. And what he derided as something being destined to perish is still alive. That is, obviously the faith that could not possibly disappear. But that is still alive, and there's many more signs of it. As small as is the number of faithful Catholics these days, the small groups of faithful Catholics that there are show many more signs of life than the Novus Ordo. The Novus Ordo is still having numbers. I talked about this before. It has a certain largeness to it still, obviously, but it's the largeness of an enormous rotting corpse that's bloated with corruption. That's the largeness of the Novus Ordo, and greatly reduced in size from what it was. The corruption is such that it's lost it lost its numbers to a huge extent, but it's still objectively large, which means actually that what largeness it has is something of a leftover of the flourishing state of the church prior to Vatican II. That actually just goes to show just how vibrant the church really was before Vatican II. That after decades and decades of nothing but unmitigated destruction and absolute free fall in every aspect, that there's still large numbers left means that the church was very, very vibrant all those decades ago, and would have just continued expanding had Vatican II not happened. In a material sense, the church was just on an upward, even then, at the end of the reign of Pope Pius XII, at the end of his reign, at his death, everything was still on an upward trajectory. Now, which continued through, again, I've said that before, just taking one example, a seminary in Australia that saw its peak enrollment in the mid to late 60s, I forget the exact year, but was gone. Everything just shut down by the early 70s. That means that upward trajectory continued through Vatican II and only disappeared when the worship of this new immanentistic religion appeared. That's when the drop-off really began. That's when the upward trajectory stopped and the free fall began. That's when that began. So Loisy says this. Let me see the irony of it now. "It could continue if it transformed itself, but it does not wish to do so." So he's saying one way or the other, the Catholic faith as we know it now will be gone. The only way that the church can save itself is by getting rid of the faith. This is ultimately what he's saying. He's not exactly being subtle about it here, but this is another way of putting it. Liberal Catholicism, that is the religion of humanity, as in dogmaless humanitarianism, without moral despotism or theological infallibility, could be the true religion, but it is not Catholicism. In other words, dogmaless humanitarianism, that's the true religion. Religion in which you don't tell anybody what to think about anything. Not even what's contained in divine revelation. None of that. Don't pretend to tell people what to think. Theological despotism. Don't pretend to have authority from God to decide upon these matters. Theological infallibility, or moral despotism, or theological infallibility. That kind of Catholic Church. Now, maybe that could become a receptacle of the true religion, but that's not Catholicism. And what he means is, as being practiced right now, in just the normal state of the church in the early 20th century. Certainly what we could call a normal situation, by and large. Aside from, I suppose, it's the state of things in various nations, that those nations were disordered because they were not one with the church. But that's another story. That the church itself was, of course, in what we would certainly say, relative to what we have now, a normal situation. Roncalli's biographer says, Matthieusi was better informed than Roncalli on Duchesne. Duchesne's History of the Early Church was placed on the index on January 12, 1912, just 4 months later. Matthieusi's allusion to an element of Kantianism in a certain prelate was correctly taken to be a reference to Cardinal Mercier. So that, seeing Cardinal Mercier, we've had mention of him before, and tried to come up with this synthesis, this reconciliation between St. Thomas and Immanuel Kant. Yeah, a modernizer, at least a modernizer. And also friends with, remember, Cardinal Ferrari, and a thorn in whose flesh this Father Matthieusi is, remember, and also Roncalli's own bishop, Radini Tedeschi. That all of these people, they're all in cahoots, as the saying goes. They're all co-conspirators in trying to at least protect modernism. Yeah, if they're not modernists, they're modernizers, and that's actually worse, as we've established. Cardinal Ferrari, part of the group calling such visits as these, or calling St. Pius X's apostolic visitations, apostolic vexations. That's the group we're talking about here. So most offensive of all were his disparaging remarks about the late Leo XIII and the young men of Christian democracy. This is also very telling. Notice that not only does Roncalli and company, do they not complain about either the predecessors or the successors of St. Pius X, but just taking Leo XIII as example here, they positively praise him. They liked him, certainly. And any kind of criticism of anything he espoused is something offensive to them. Because remember, it was really during the reign of Leo XIII that modernism came to be. Definitely all of the seeds were there, all of the feeders were in place, but by the end of his reign, it had emerged fully molded. And that's why St. Pius X spent his entire reign dealing with it. St. Pius X was the one to recognize that and seek to take it down. Whereas Leo XIII, to disparage anything or to say what exactly he said, I don't have Matthieusi's lecture notes, but it'd be interesting to have those actually if any such thing survives. We'd have to look for that to see if it does. But interesting that he would find that's offensive, most offensive of all, anything critical of Leo XIII. Remember his whole program of rallying to the Third Republic. Which was a policy that St. Pius X certainly reversed. And also the young men of Christian democracy. To criticize any of that is something that is most offensive to Roncalli.